Welcome everyone to another edition of the Classic Comic Archive, a series where I recap and review many of Marvel Comics' most seminal early issues. Our story for today is The Amazing Spider-Man issue 6, cover dated November of 1963. This issue marks the first appearance of longtime Spider-Man villain the Lizard and was written by Stan Lee, drawn by Steve Ditko, and lettered by Art Simek. Our issue opens up with a striking splash page, teasing Spider-Man's coming battle against the Lizard and his alligator minions. Yet before we can witness such an epic confrontation, we must first travel to the Florida Everglades, the birthplace of the reptilian villain. It's there that the Lizard is terrorizing a group of men, the first to encounter him. He's furiously demanding their exit from the swamp, as he claims it for himself. The group of men are startled by the Lizard, and one retrieves a rifle to strike down the monster. The man shoots the Lizard square in the side, yet the creature's scales are too thick and the bullet has no effect. But the shot does anger the monster, and he powerfully snaps a large tree in two and hoists it above his head to hurl at the men. But at this point they're already fleeing in terror. Their encounter with the Lizard quickly becomes local legend and then a national headline, eventually reaching New York City newsstands. It's there that Spider-Man reads a copy of the Daily Bugle newspaper, emblazoned with the headline, "The Bugle challenges Spider-Man to defeat the Lizard." Spider-Man brushes off the headline as a cheap marketing gimmick, but wonders if his boss J. Jonah Jameson, the publisher of the Bugle, will send him on a paid trip to Florida to capture photos of the Lizard. So Spider-Man arrives at Jameson's office as Peter Parker and asks the publisher about sending him to Florida. But Jameson balks at the idea. It turns out that Peter's suspicion was right, as the eye-catching headline was nothing but a gimmick, and Jameson doesn't even think the Lizard is real. So Peter leaves the publisher's office disappointed, but his spirits are lifted as he runs into Betty Brant on his way out. She's Jameson's secretary, and over the last few issues has developed a flirtatious relationship with Peter. She tells the photographer that he thinks Jameson should send him to Florida, to which Peter jokes that she ought to be publisher instead of him. Yet the issue then shifts forward a day and to a natural history museum. Peter's come to the museum to learn about lizards, as he still thinks there's a chance Jameson will change his mind. It's at the dinosaur exhibit that he runs into two of his classmates, Flash Thompson and Liz Allen. The three teenagers listen in on a lecture about the dinosaurs, but Peter's spider senses suddenly pick up danger. Sure enough, two shady thieves have stolen an artifact and are attempting to leave the museum undetected. Thus Peter silently slinks away to a nearby bathroom and begins putting on his Spider-Man costume to deal with the thieves. But just as he finishes, he hears a commotion and stealthily pokes his head out of the bathroom. It turns out that a security guard had seen the artifacts theft and has caught up with the crooks. But the criminals have pulled out pistols and taken Liz hostage. Her date Flash does nothing to stop them, a stark contrast from the hero he's propped himself up to be. Only Spider-Man is brave enough to face the criminals, as he springs out from the bathroom and knocks out both with a single punch. The hero then checks on Liz, who's completely fine, but in awe at Spider-Man's daring rescue. The wall crawler tells her that the pleasure was all his, and affectionately calls her Blue Eyes. He then flees the scene to change back into his civilian guise. Thus a few minutes later Peter returns to Liz and Flash, but only to find the former completely starstruck by Spider-Man. Flash tries to snap Liz back to reality, but she purposefully ignores him to romanticize her rescue as a stroke of fate. Yet as Peter listens to Liz's unfolding fantasy, he overhears a radio broadcast that's criticizing Spider-Man for seemingly ignoring the threat of the Lizard. With that, Peter decides he's had enough of the challenge and must find a way to get Jameson to sponsor a trip to Florida. So later that day Peter arrives at the publisher's office, but this time as Spider-Man. He webs Jameson still, and tells him that he's accepted his challenge to battle the Lizard, so a photographer ought to be sent to Florida to cover the story. With that, Spider-Man leaves, without even giving Jameson a chance to respond. Yet as soon as he does, Betty Brant walks into Jameson's office, where the irate publisher demands she call Peter Parker. And so a few minutes later, Peter arrives back at the Bugle to meet with Jameson. But on his way in he runs into Betty. It seems that he's about to ask her on a date, but any plans of his are interrupted by Jameson, who demands he enter his office at once. Inside, Jameson tells Peter he's sending him to Florida, although he doesn't mention Spider-Man's visit. Peter is ecstatic to be going on the trip, but any excitement is dulled as Jameson reveals he's coming along. Nonetheless, Peter heads home and asks his Aunt May for permission to go to Florida. At first she scoffs at the idea, considering what she's heard about the lizard. But when Peter tells her that Jameson is going with him, she readily changes her mind and agrees to the trip. So the next day Peter and the publisher board a plane to Florida. Peter's brought with him a collection of newspaper clippings about the lizard, as well as a few maps of the area that the monster's been seen. He begins sorting through the items and stumbles on an article by Dr. Kurt Connors, a renowned reptile expert who lives near the Everglades. Peter figures that Dr. Connors might be able to help him defeat the lizard, so he decides to visit him first. The issue then shifts forward to just after Peter and Jameson have disembarked from their flight. The young photographer tells his boss that he has to pick up some film equipment before he heads to their hotel. Jameson questions why Peter didn't bother buying the items in New York, but nonetheless sees him off and leaves for the hotel. Yet this is just an excuse from Peter to get away for a while and track down the lizard without Jameson tagging along. As Spider-Man, Peter travels to the Everglades and finds that it's been blocked off by armed patrols of policemen. Of course, this isn't enough to stop the hero, who swings off of a nearby rooftop and into the swamp undetected. Well, undetected by the policeman, but not the lizard himself, who hides in a deep marsh and waits for Spider-Man to pass through. As the hero does, the lizard powerfully yanks him into the marsh. A stunned Spider-Man struggles to combat his reptilian foe underwater. He grabs a glob of mud from the marsh bed and smashes it into the lizard's face, which disorients the monster and gives him a chance to escape onto land. But the hero's no safer there than underwater, as the lizard recovers just as quickly and powerfully swipes at Spider-Man with his tail. The strike misses the hero, but manages to split into a tree behind him. Yet despite witnessing this amazing feat of strength, Spider-Man foolishly attempts to climb onto the tail to reach his foe. Yet of course this is a perfect opportunity for the lizard to powerfully whip his extra appendage and send Spider-Man flying across the Everglades. The hero harshly crashes into some trees, but luckily lands right next to Dr. Connor's house. He heads inside through an open window to warn the doctor of the lizard's presence, but only finds inside a weeping woman. Spider-Man recognizes the woman as Dr. Connor's wife and tells her that it's not safe to stay in her house while the lizard is so close. But then, Mrs. Connors tragically reveals that her husband actually is the lizard. Before he was a renowned reptile expert, Connors was an army medic who lost an arm in battle. Thus once he began researching reptiles, he became obsessed with their ability to regrow limbs and the prospect that this ability could be artificially passed on to other animals. So he began work on an experimental serum to do just that. His test trials proved successful on mice, but Connors recklessly decided to test the serum on himself. At first it worked, as the scientist's lost arm miraculously grew back. But a horrific side effect quickly transformed Connors into the lizard. Ashamed at the monster he'd become, Connors fled his family so they'd never see his new form. But the next day he sneakily returned to his laboratory to develop a counter serum, but his transformation had cost him his brilliance. The lizard was simply too savage to be a scientist, so with the last of his humanity, he wrote a goodbye letter to his wife and young son, and left to live amongst his reptilian brethren in the swamp. But the lizard's condition is ever worsening. Each day he becomes less human and more animal. That brings us back to the present, where Spider-Man hears a cry outside from Connor's young son Billy. The lizard has approached the boy, for deep underneath his monstrous appearance he still loves him. But Billy is of course frightened by his father and flees from him, but into the path of a vicious snake. Spider-Man swings in just in time and saves Billy from the snake, but the lizard interprets this rescue as the hero's attempt to steal his son. So as soon as Spider-Man's dropped Billy off to safety, the lizard attacks. Spider-Man lands a solid punch to the villain's face, but it's the wall crawler who reels from the blow, as his fist nearly shatters against the lizard's rock-hard scales. The hero next tries to wrangle his foe with webbing, but even that proves useless against the lizard's monstrous strength. Spider-Man only finds reprieve as Mrs. Connors arrives outside and calls for Billy. Her voice strikes a hidden chord deep within the lizard, who suddenly slinks back to the swamp in shame. A few minutes later, Spider-Man returns to Mrs. Connors and asks to see her husband's scientific notes. She agrees, and thankfully Spider-Man is a whiz kid who can understand the notes' complex chemistry. So after a few hours, the hero has successfully applied Dr. Connor's notes to the creation of a counter serum that can reverse the scientist's transformation. But just as Spider-Man wonders how he'll get the lizard to ingest the serum, the monster himself barges into his old laboratory to destroy the meddling wall crawler. Spider-Man hands off the antidote to Mrs. Connors for safekeeping and then seeks to reason with the lizard. But of course there's no reasoning with a savage animal, as the villain immediately hurls a large desk at Spider-Man. The hero isn't fast enough to dodge it, and he's sent crashing into a cabinet. But the lizard wastes no more time in delivering a finishing blow, as he furiously slashes at a pinned Spider-Man with his vicious tail. And so within only seconds, the hero has been defeated. Thus the lizard triumphantly leaves, and brags of his master plan to raise a lizard army. But Spider-Man had not truly been destroyed, he'd simply had the wind knocked out of him. As he recovers from the lizard's beating, Mrs. Connors reveals that the villain plans to inject his original serum into the lizards of the Everglades, creating a super-powered lizard army under his command. Spider-Man realizes just how many lizards there are in the swamp and just how quickly they can multiply. He knows he must act fast to stop the lizard before the monster raises an unstoppable army. So he grabs the counter serum from Mrs. Connors and heads out to once again find the lizard. He fashions some swamp shoes out of his webbing and grabs a nearby stick to paddle his way through the Everglades. Luckily Spider-Man senses pick up the lizard's trail, leading the hero to an old abandoned Spanish fort. There the lizard is surrounded by several subservient alligators whom the villain can communicate with. Spider-Man watches the strange scene from a hidden vantage point on one of the fort's walls and even snaps a few photos of it. But the lizard doesn't notice Spider-Man and freely tells his minions of his plan to pour his serum into the swamp and raise an army of super reptiles from which he'll conquer mankind. With that the lizard prepares to enter the fort and ready his serum. But suddenly the old wall that's supporting Spider-Man's weight begins to crumble, sending the hero careening down towards the lizard. He recovers quickly from the fall, but now has to contend with the lizard's alligator minions, who the villain has ordered to attack. Spider-Man leaps back onto the fort and climbs high enough that the alligators can't bite him. But he doesn't anticipate that the lizard possesses the powers of a gecko and can also climb walls. So when the hero reaches the top of the fort, he's met by the villain, who begins battering at him with his tail and orders his alligator minions to do the same. The strikes begin to crumble the wall he's crawling on, so Spider-Man swings out and into an open window. But the lizard is just as quick and lunges at the hero as he arrives inside the fort. Spider-Man momentarily blocks the villain's strike with a web shield, but he knows that this reprieve is fleeting, and he won't be able to defeat the lizard in a fair fight. Instead Spider-Man decides to keep him on the move and distracted from his evil scheme until he can find the right moment to administer the counter serum. So Spider-Man goads his foe into a large chamber with a single exit and entrance, which he closes behind him, trapping them both inside. The room is a large empty cylinder, which Spider-Man quickly climbs to the top of. The lizard follows suit and tries to grab a hold of Spider-Man, but the hero leaps out of the way and down towards the ground. As he's falling past the lizard, Spider-Man grabs onto the villain's tail and forces him down too. As they're now both falling, Spider-Man speedily climbs atop the startled villain and forcibly administers the counter serum just as they land. Yet the serum doesn't seem to work, as the lizard begins battering a confused Spider-Man. Trapped in the chamber with nowhere to go, our nearly defeated hero becomes tangled in a mess of his own webs. There he helplessly lays as the lizard prepares to deliver a truly finishing blow. But suddenly the villain is overcome by a massive headache that sends him reeling away from Spider-Man. It's the counter serum taking effect as the lizard finds himself transforming back into Dr. Connors. Returned with only one arm, Spider-Man declares that Connors is fully free of the lizard identity and thus takes the grateful scientist back to his home. There he reconnects with his wife and burns away the last of his research so that his experiments will never be repeated. But Dr. Connors is willing to accept punishment for the chaos that the lizard wrought. Yet Spider-Man is merciful and agrees to keep the lizard's true identity a secret so that the good-natured scientist can return to his family for good. The next day, Peter returns to his hotel, where J. Jonah Jameson is speaking with a police officer who's been searching for the seemingly missing photographer. But when Peter approaches Jameson, the publisher is more so angry than relieved and gears up to give the teenager a piece of his mind. Peter interrupts his boss's furor by showing him the photos he captured of the lizard. Jameson questions Peter on how he got them, to which the young photographer clumsily responds that he bought them off of an old Indian guide at the edge of the Everglades. Jameson accepts the excuse, but doesn't trust the word of an old Indian guide. So he declares the photos as fakes and angrily tears them up in front of Peter. He then rebukes the photographer for wasting his time with their trip and orders him to immediately pack his things for New York. On the plane back, Peter asks Jameson if he'll be compensated for his time, but of course the publisher isn't going to cough up any cash when Peter, in his eyes, didn't get any worthy photos. In fact, he even thinks that Peter owes him for their airfare and hotel bill. But back at his home, Peter is ready to relax after defeating the lizard. So he decides to call Betty Brant and see if she'll go on a date with him the following night. But he remembers she's working late that day and decides to call Liz Allen instead. She answers the phone, but tells Peter that he and Flash need to stop clogging up her phone line, as she's waiting for a call from Spider-Man. With that she hangs up, leaving Peter to joke that only someone with his luck could become their own competition. The issue then shifts focus to Jameson's office, where Betty Brant is reading aloud a letter mailed in by Spider-Man. It reads, "Roses are red, violets are blue, I'm still at large, so phooey to you." The letter does nothing to endear Jameson to the wall crawler, who once again vows to expose the so-called menace if it's the last thing he does. The issue subsequently ends with a tease for the next issue, as we see the foreboding silhouette of a familiar avian figure. While that concludes our story for today, Marvel has appended 2 letter pages at the end of this issue. For those unaware, letter pages were once hallmarks of the comics industry in an age before the internet. They gave Marvel an opportunity to respond to the praise, criticism, and suggestions they'd received about their stories. All of the letters presented in this issue were sent by mail to Marvel almost 60 years ago, and cover up to Amazing Spider-Man issue 3. While I will not be reading the letter pages aloud, please take a moment to look and see what readers of the time thought of this series. It's certainly an interesting experience all these years later. And with that, we've concluded Amazing Spider-Man issue 6 and another episode of the Classic Comic Archive. But as always, I would like to offer a brief review of this issue. Overall, I thought that this was another great Spider-Man story, perhaps even the best so far. In some ways, I thought that this issue was similar to issue 3, but actually improved in areas. For example, both stories' villains are brilliant scientists who are transformed into monsters after a failed experiment. But unlike Dr. Octopus, whose life before his accident was a complete mystery, the Lizard was given a full backstory as a family man whose experiment was born from a genuine desire to help others. By making Dr. Connors such an endearing person, the Lizard goes from being just another monster for Spider-Man to fight, to a tragic figure that is in desperate need of help. Villains like these are the most compelling, and I'm thus left disappointed in knowing that the Lizard won't appear again for nearly 40 issues. But in any case, let me know what you thought of this issue and the video, and feel free to suggest other classic comics for me to cover. Thanks for watching.